Okay, so before we begin, I'd like to do an acknowledgement for the land we're on as publisher and author. If we're to make steps toward a reform of Western culture's relationship to the environment, this in part demands that settlers acknowledge that they are uninvited guests on the land who must shape their behavior with that knowledge. But first, we must acknowledge those who have been in relationship with the lands for thousands of years. So Octavia Cade is a settler living in the Waikato-Tainui territory. Like many indigenous nations across the world, the Waikato-Tainui Maori have endured generations of war and land theft due to European colonization. Efforts to restore the land to the Maori are inextricably linked to ecological preservation and flourishing. In 2008, the Waikato-Tainui signed a deed of settlement with the Crown for the Waikato River. The 2010 Act supports work to restore and protect the health and well-being of the river for future generations. Waikato-Tainui still has outstanding claims over the West Coast harbors and the Wairoa and the Maioro land blocks. Climate justice means restoring right relationship with the land's original inhabitants as well as the land itself. I am also a settler, and I live and run Stelliform Press on the traditional territory shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations, which was acknowledged in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Agreement. The wampum uses the symbols of a dish to represent the territory and one spoon to represent that the people are to share the resources of the land and only take what they need. And this image represents an ethic that we need now and in the future. So the novella that we're celebrating today is one that demands we consider our relationship to the environment and what actions we can take in response to exploitation. It's a question that artists are increasingly engaging with, and we're so lucky to have some of them with us to help us launch the impossible resurrection of grief. And I'll introduce them as we go through the program. So first, we have Tiff Morris, who will start us off with some poetry. Tiff Morris is a Mi'kmaq editor and writer of speculative poetry and fiction. She is the author of the chapbook Havoc in Silence from Molten Molecular Minutia, which came out in 2019. Her work has been featured in Room Magazine, Prairie Fire, Eye to the Telescope, and Uncanny, and is forthcoming from Nightmare Magazine. A member of the Indigenous Editors Association, she writes, edits, reads tarot, and hunts UFOs in Jabuktuk, otherwise known as Halifax, Nova Scotia. And Tiff, I will pass the digital stage over to you.
Okay. Malalan Selena, Malaliok, everybody, for being here. I'm going to share my screen so you can read along with my poems. Perfect. The first one is Rewilding Under Those Conditions. Stick this time, as in half-formed sentry, with a pin, into the butterfly thorax, into embolism. There is not a word in every language for extinction event, but sometimes there are a few words for burning. Netema Gladijig, they appear burning. Nugwalud, I set it on fire. Gachol Kitig, they are burned through. A cathedral into skeleton, irritation into sensation, ozone into nothing. And it's not just forests, Nipgul, that burn, that fall. And it's not just the prisoners whose hands hold this water, hold this water that they hold for no money, for nothing. Muundugu, Bugwell, Nunuk, Nibug, Eswiag, Ula, Nunutigu. There isn't much forest left here in our territory, but there are ashes, remnants, golf courses smoking in cinders, more beautiful than barbed wire on any cleared skied day by far. What is more beautiful than every golf course burning and rewilding with the things that grow under those conditions? Wildflowers, probably, mushrooms and moss and all of it, blooming like seizing. After the fire was gone, after hands held water, and mansions became lanterns, a snake was found, jaws opened and hissing, having bitten the fire as it burned. And that one appeared in Understory magazine, I think it was last year. And this next one is Species Made Extinct by Human Activities, mistranslations from Wikipedia articles in that category. And basically what I did was I took multiple animals featured in those articles and translated them between multiple different languages in Google Translate to kind of investigate how the animals transformed through language and through translation, and how the animals became poetry, and how the violence of human activity imposed itself and showed up in the poetry. So here is the poem. 1. Feather. The bird is invisible, often found in forests. They grow on tall trees that eat a lot of fruit and speak the native language. The trees are covered with feathers. Feathers do not change over time. The majority of them are in life to protect it. With his eye for the blind, he is best known for collecting the bones, mimicking the cold of other birds, and various messages from the sky. In winter, small plants become large and white, spread from ear to ear. 2. Fur. There is more than the old bones and cloud records, a link to the precious fruit eaten with flowers. The wildcat was confronted by the threat of predators, the sound of rumbling noise, and a lot of fire slowly moving in the contours of the ocean. When the grass, trees, and reindeer seemed to disappear, he fell into a storm. 3. Scale. This is the last line of Dangerous Animals. They think you're playing with a toy. Bone fragments and oil, the oil in a flame of fire. They jumped on the fading of the day, looking for fresh food and water. The look is long and lacks color. The cause of the accident is unknown. These giant valleys are loving and fearful. And that appeared in the Watch Your Head anthology from Coach House Books. Well, Alvin, that's all I have.
Thank you, Tiff. That was just magnificent. The poems that you shared today, and also a lot of your other work, uses horror to express what I'm perceiving to be a deep love of the land. And I was wondering if you could say a few words about how you see that connection working. What connection do you see between fear or horror and ecological relationship?
Thank you. That's a great question. I've been kind of dealing a lot in a lot of my poems with both this love-based ecology and also this kind of apocalyptic thinking, just given what we're contending with as a species these days and what other species are contending with. And I think that, you know, there are different ways to have a fear and reverence for nature. And there's something called indigenous reverential eco-fear that doesn't romanticize nature, but is very real about just the awe-inspiring aspects of nature and being a part of that and not apart from it. And I think that really interrogating our relationships with the land that we live on and all the creatures that live within it, it can be difficult, and it can be a source of terror because we're so used to kind of sanitizing those relationships and really thinking of land and nature as utilitarian and not something that is just adjacent to us, a web that we're a part of. So yeah, it's interesting, I think, to interrogate those ideas, and that can be pretty fearful and on an existential level.
Thank you so much. I really hope that I get to have further conversation with you about that in the future. So next we have Shannon Roszell. She is here to perform her recent single, Gonna Love You. Shannon is a powerhouse performer, a singer-songwriter from the Kawartha Lakes, northeast of Toronto, Canada. Her sound is best characterized as symphonic indie rock, fusing orchestral voicings with searing electric guitar and vocals. An outspoken environmentalist, Roszell has created performance art pieces in protest of the tar sands pipelines. Roszell's first single, Gonna Love You, which came out in March 2021, is a post-apocalyptic love song to our damaged earth. Her debut album, Within the Shimmering Darkness, coming out spring 2022, is rich with sonic landscapes as expansive as the view out her farmhouse window. All right. So we have prepared a video for Shannon's performance because of tech issues. We are trying to prevent them. So what I'm going to do is I will share my screen and share the video with everyone, and then we'll have a little chat with Shannon.
Shannon Roszell. I'm a singer-songwriter from the Kawartha Lakes here in Ontario, Canada. I am happy to be here with you guys to celebrate the launch of the Impossible Resurrection of Grief. I'm sharing with you one of my most recent singles, Gonna Love You. It's a post-apocalyptic love song to the damaged earth. I'm trying to talk about how we balance loving people despite all of these environmental difficulties that we're facing and the environmental anxiety that I think is just sort of looming above us all. Anyways, I hope you enjoy the song, and I hope you have a great rest of the lunch.
When the sun no longer
Thank you for that performance, Shannon.
My
Wow.
pleasure.
So while we're all coming down from that intensity, I'd like to ask you about the inspiration for the song. So in Octavia's book, grief is a mental health disorder which is triggered by specific environmental losses. And I'm wondering if there were any particular environmental losses that inspired the apocalyptic vision of your song.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number that are sort of mentioned in there. Fukushima obviously was in there, you know, the fracturing. I lived in the Yukon for a period of time, and there's something called the Peel watershed up there, and they were starting to do fracking, or they were proposing to do fracking up there. But the biggest thing for me, of course, has been and remains the tar sands in northern Alberta, Canada. I was lucky enough to get to go on a healing walk in 2013, led by elders. It was a 14-kilometer walk around what they call the Syncrude Loop, and Syncrude is one of the two sort of major producers of oil from, you know, the oil sands in Canada. What was really remarkable and disturbing about that was so many things, but the one thing that really stuck with me was there was not a bird to be seen. There was no nature anywhere. And yet I looked, and we're walking around this tailings pond, and there's a boat on this pond, and every so often, and there's a person in this boat, and every so often explosives are going off. And so I talked to somebody who was asking, like, what, you know, what's going on with that? And apparently it is actually somebody's job to go and set off explosives every now and then to prevent birds from landing on the water, because if they land on this toxic pond, they simply sink through and die. Like, they just perish in the water. Wow. Unbelievable. And that really stuck with me. Myself, I had to return to our camp, which was about a 45-minute drive south of the tar sands, because my asthma was unbearable. So I had to go and like get my puffers and have them with me. And I was very ill after just walking for the day there. Truly powerful. It was wonderful to get to, like, truly an honor to walk with the Fort McMurray First Nation, the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, of course, the Little Buffalo First Nation that organized that. So for me, it was one of those things that doesn't really go away. And to see it and to feel it and breathe it and embody it was really something that sticks with me. And that sort of sense, it was interesting. We've already spoken about, you know, that apocalyptic feeling. And I feel like that was really something that I felt then. And now I only feel more for different, you know, different equally traumatizing reasons. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Yes, thanks so much for sharing that experience with us. Okay, so now we've come to our main event. With everyone still dwelling in that contradiction and the necessity of love in a time of profound loss, it is my pleasure to introduce Octavia Cade. Octavia Cade is a New Zealand writer with a PhD in science communication. She attended Clarion West 2016 and has won 3 Sir Julius Vogel Awards for speculative fiction and is a Bram Stoker nominee. She was the 2020 writer in residence at Massey University, where she wrote The Impossible Resurrection of Grief. So tonight we're here to celebrate a novella which tells the story of a marine biologist, Ruby, and the grief, which is an unstoppable melancholia that is linked to the collapse of ecosystems and the extinction of species. So when Ruby's friend, mourning the loss of the Great Barrier Reef, succumbs to the grief, the letters she leaves behind reveal the hidden world of the resurrected dead. The Tasmanian tiger, brought back from extinction in an isolated facility, is only the first. But rebirth is not always biological, and it comes with a price. As a scientist, Ruby resists the grief by focusing on her research on resilient jellyfish, but she can't avoid choosing which side she's on. So struggling with the loss of her friend and her impending divorce, can she fight against the dead and the forces behind them, while doing so risks her home, her life, and the entire biosphere. So Octavia, I will pass the digital stage to you now for a reading.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, everyone. I'd like to say a special thank you to Tiffany and Shannon for their gorgeous performances that we just had then. It was really lovely. Thank you. This, my wee book with that gorgeous cover by Rachel Lobenberg. I'm going to be reading a extract from when Ruby, who is, as Selena said, is the main character, has gone down to Tasmania to meet the woman who has resurrected the thylacines. And she's calling this woman Granny because she's there is a fairy tale theme going through here, and Ruby has sort of inextricably linked this woman to a different kind of fairy tale. So the thylacines had once been known as Tasmanian tigers. They're not tigers, Granny said. Don't look at the stripes. Look at how they behave. The joey squirmed on Granny's lap, trying to get free. One tumbled to the floor and shook itself before hopping on its two back legs to her ankles. The joey buried its teeth in the already ragged hem of Granny's trousers, easily shredding the material. The other crawled to the edge of her lap and stared down at its littermate, intent on the shredding and entirely indifferent to the pats that Granny bestowed upon it. Marsupial wolves, said Granny. That was their other name, the Tasmanian wolf. Of course they're not wolves either. Her face was as watchful as a hunter, the face of a woman who revelled in the bite. Her upper lip twitched, exposing glimpses of yellowed teeth. I couldn't tell if she was doing it deliberately, trying to unsettle me, or if it was an unconscious gesture born out of intimidation and threat. I might have been invited, albeit implicitly, but my presence was still an intrusion, and the grief that so unbalanced her was not trusting of outsiders. It was us that killed them, she said. Changing climate made them vulnerable, and we did the rest. Hunting and hunting and hunting. Their extinction was deliberate. We weren't so damn indifferent to them that we let the world take them. I suppose that's something to be grateful for, that at least we cared enough to do it ourselves. We liked doing it. She blinked at me, slowly. Do you like it? Hunting? I've never tried. I think you'd be good at it. You can care for something and watch it die and let it die. I know all about you, she said, and what the sea witch hadn't told her she must have inferred somehow. The truth was I did let the sea witch die, or at the very least I didn't try hard enough to save her, and it wasn't a good death. Truth is, even if I could have saved her, I don't know if I would have. She'd only have tried again and again and again. The next time might even have been worse, more painful. That's what grief is, I think, an unshrinking look at the inevitable. Granny invited me to stay the night. I would rather have declined her offer, but I had yet to understand what she wanted of me, and I wasn't sure she would have let me go when that understanding was absent. She was old, of course, and most likely frailer than she appeared. I could have pushed past her if I wanted to. I could go to all the newspapers in the land if I wanted to. It would be the story of the century. But Granny was here, and those delicate creatures were here. They were sleeping in the bed with grief. And all that talk of letting loved ones die made me worry for their safety. I wished I could trust her as a caretaker, but I didn't, not entirely. So I decided to stay and not to sleep. I sat up in a cold night in a cold bed, reading of tigers and wolves and marsupial beasts, their skeletons and observed behaviour. Granny had left a stack of journal articles by the bed, the sections of what their authors believed were a dead species. I wondered if the articles were a deliberate reminder of shredded paper and plastic bells, the fishing trail of a tentacle dragged through water, but how could she have known so much of what the sea witch had done? Perhaps their letters shed more than I knew. I had no way of knowing if I'd read them all. Granny didn't sleep either. I could hear her up and down the hall all night, the quick pattering footsteps of the old when they're trying to be light and cunning creatures. In the middle of that cold night, I ventured out into the hall to search for another blanket and realised what those footsteps really were. Patter, patter, patter. And it was only because the floors were hard wood that I could hear them. On another surface, nocturnal hunters would be so very silent. Catching the dark outlines of shapes in the hall, my back slammed against a wall before my brain understood why. Fragments of my earlier reading surfaced between ragged breaths. a paper on thylacine physiology and what their skeletons implied about their hunting techniques. All I could think of was the morphology of their limbs, the construction of elbow joints that suggested that thylacines were ambush predators, tigers rather than wolves. The two I'd held in my lap were too small for predation, but moonlight shining through windows reflected eyes a lot further from the ground than a tiny joey could account for. I could hear breathing over footsteps and almost silent panting, and I couldn't tell which breaths were mine and which were theirs. But there was a faint stench of feeding, as if meat had been left out for pets, and the scent of it had stained their teeth and tongues. The whole house was shifting with them, stripes and small sounds in that warm, meat-scented breath, the convergence of the dead and the living. And I didn't know if they hunted in a pack like wolves, or if together they were enough to bring down an animal so much bigger than they were. They were living in a house, but that didn't mean domestication. They weren't dogs. And if resurrection and care had changed their nature, I had no indication of it. They may have started out sleeping in Granny's bed, but the scars on her arms, they were too big and too deep to have come from Joey's. Those marks had come from creatures that hunted. Creatures raised by women who had teased me with the prospect of hunting, and who I suspected enjoyed hunting herself, both the stalking and the bloody death. Can you watch something die and let it die, she'd asked, and whether she was speaking to me or of me, I was no longer sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Octavia. Okay, so we're going to move into the Q&A section of the launch. And if our audience has any questions, please post them in the chat. And I'm going to start off with some questions, but we'll quickly move to audience questions if they appear. Okay, so I would love to start our conversation by talking a little bit about New Zealand. A lot of us in North America have had very envious eyes on New Zealand since the beginning of the pandemic. So from an outsider's perspective, you seem to have a government that is ready to make hard choices in order to protect people. So we've heard a lot about New Zealand's pandemic response, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about New Zealand's climate change response. Is New Zealand making the kind of care-oriented or community-centered choices with regards to climate change as it seems to do with the pandemic?
Not so much. We kind of suck in that regard. Of the 43 industrialized nations, only 12 have had emissions increases from sort of 1990 to 2018, and New Zealand is one of them. We have a very low carbon emission as a country because we are so small. Mm-hmm. But our per capita emissions are enormous. They are right up there with the worst in the world. And we have an interesting emissions profile in that most of the emissions here come from agriculture, the methane from cows, and secondarily from transport. And that makes us different from a lot of places whose emissions profile may tend more towards, say, energy. A lot of New Zealand's power is renewable. It comes from hydro and geothermal and wind power. But methane and our agricultural emissions are what lets us down. And no government seems to be willing to tackle that because farming is a powerful lobby in this country. And, you know, if you're a farmer, it's your livelihood. And in the one sense, you cannot blame people for not knowing what to do. If it's their industry that's causing the problems, if it's their family farm, they've had it for generations, you know, how do you fix this? And farmers are trying, a lot of them, on their own to come up with solutions, to do more riparian planting on the streams on their farm, to look at ways to reduce their methane emissions. But there is very little leadership coming through from the government on any of that.
Yeah, I think we're in a similar situation in Canada where industry is driving our emissions. Again, we're also a small country with huge emissions, and yeah, how do you ask people not to make a living? And it's really just a matter of system change, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are some system changes that, you know, the government has been doing. Last year, Jacinda Ardern's government, I think, declared a climate emergency. And they are aiming for this country to be carbon neutral by 2025. But again, there's the problem of the methane and the agricultural emissions. Are they including that? Are they not? This year, what they did actually not very long ago, I think it was only a few weeks ago, that we're the first country in the world to bring in a law forcing financial institutions to report on the effects of climate change. It is now mandatory for them to disclose the environmental impact of their investments. So that's a systems level change that hopefully can be seen in other countries, but it's not addressing a lot of the problems that we have here.
So The Impossible Resurrection of Grief is not set in New Zealand primarily. It's set in Australia, and I was wondering why you made the choice to set it in Australia.
Well, it's sort of 50-50, Australia and New Zealand. New Zealand is an interesting case study because as an archipelago, we are affected by rising sea levels and so on, but we are also insulated in a way from a lot of the worst effects from things like temperature rise, because the ocean acts as an insulator. And so while we are seeing effects of climate change on the shores, and a particularly distressing one, last year in Wellington, 35% of the little blue penguin chicks on the Wellington colonies died from starvation because the warming water in the harbour is affecting the fish supply. So while there are sort of distressing things like that, a lot of the effects that we are seeing at scale are occurring across the ditch, which is, the Tasman Sea for those of you who aren't, from this part of the world. The massive bushfires, for instance, they have been so apocalyptic in scale that the smoke has actually reached this country across, thousands of kilometres of ocean. There were times last year the year before, you'd look out the window and it was yellow. In this country from so far away. And then, of course, there's things like the Great Barrier Reef, which is this iconic ecosystem, which, Australia has that the rest of us don't. And there's very visual impact of what is happening there. So I think that is something not so much appealing as approachable, an approachable way of getting people to think about climate change. If you're not looking at, say, the small increase in temperature on in New Zealand is less, it hits you less in the face than something like the smoke arriving from Australia from the bushfires.
Yeah, the Great Barrier Reef, as you said, is iconic, and it is really the key environmental or the key ecosystem that you discuss in the book. It is the thing that drives the plot, right?
I don't know why I'm so attached to it. I've never been there. The only way I can get there, would be to fly, which would be to increase my carbon emissions, which would push it closer to the brink. And, there's my thinking, how selfish am I? What bargains can I make with myself to see this thing before it dies, before I do? And, is this worth it? How selfish can I be? But it's the only ecosystem you can see from space. And it's bleaching over and over again. There are crown of thorns starfish marching down from warmer waters because they can now, just eating everything in its path. I mean, it's the entire ecosystem there is just slowly dying, and it's appalling and yet fascinating at the same time.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about just that struggle that I think a lot of us have, we want to live a certain kind of life, and we're very aware of the ways that kind of life is contributing to the destruction of ecosystems. And I think in that way, a lot of us can relate to Ruby and the way that she thinks and behaves in the novella. But going back to some of the ideas that we opened the launch with, I wanted to touch on Ruby and her husband, George. So George is Maori from New Zealand, and at the beginning of the novella, he lives with Ruby in Australia. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about their relationship being representative of any kind of wider relationship between the two countries, or maybe a settler approach to climate versus that of the Indigenous Maori.
Well, first of all, I would like to just sort of note that everyone who's read this so far, who's commented on it to me, you know, the reviewers or the beta readers or even the editors, everyone has said, don't you dare kill George. Don't you dare do everything to him. Everyone. I think he's the favourite part, people reading this. But there are a large proportion of Maori who immigrate to Australia. Obviously, I cannot tell you from my own perspective why, but Maori in this country are significantly less well off economically than Pākehā, which is what we call sort of New Zealand Europeans. And Australia is richer than we are. They have less of a housing crisis. The pay is better. I mean, a lot of their wealth comes from mining, which is this really sort of odd tension when you look at it through climate change. You know, if you want a better life for yourself and your family, go and work in the Australian mines. But, you know, what will these mines be doing? George isn't a miner, but there's that sort of, I think, tension underlying this idea of migration between countries. What is there for you at home? What has been left for you? What can you take elsewhere? What can you do to, you know, improve your own life? And if you've been alienated from your own home and from your own land, what is there to stop you moving? I mean, why shouldn't you move to another country if that connection has been cut?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely something that a lot of people are struggling with in these times. I see there's a question in the chat from Willie. So the question is, the word grief is capitalized like it's a proper noun. And could you explain that? What was the intention behind that choice?
Well, I wanted to separate it in a way from the idea of small g grief. Small g grief makes it sound sort of more inconsequential, which of course it isn't. I mean, if you've had a friend or loved one or something like that, someone like that die, then you know the power of sorrow and of mourning, I think. But giving it a big G allowed an easy visual way to differentiate in the text between grief for the people who you love, who leave you, and this grief that is sort of going on around you. And I've been reading a lot of sort of the academic work, because I'm an academic sort of too, on ecological grief that's been coming out just in the past couple of years. And there was one paper I read by, I think I've just got the little notes here, Consolo and Alice from 2018. They're talking about ecological grief as being disenfranchised grief, as grief that isn't often publicly acknowledged. So by giving it sort of this capital letter, by forefronting that sort of capitalization within the text, I wanted to sort of signal how it was acknowledged in this future world, how it had become so powerful and so entrenched within society that it had a specific meaning and acknowledgement. It was no longer sort of disenfranchised. It was there. It was common.
Yeah, almost like what we were just talking about, the systemic versus the individual, right? So the capital G grief is systemic.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to touch on fairy tales, because a lot of the reviewers who are talking about the book are noting that the novella is really a bit of a mashup between a science fiction thriller and a kind of a surreal fairy tale. And fairy tales come up a lot in the book. Ruby recalls that the tales of Hans Christian Andersen were her childhood favorites, and she hopes to receive an Andersen collection from the Sea Witch after her passing. So they come up multiple times in the story. So a few different Andersen tales are mentioned specifically in the novella. The Sea Witch and her boat are named from The Little Mermaid, and Ruby mentions the nightingale. Could you take us through how you're using those fairy tales and why you chose to use them?
Okay, there were a couple of reasons really. One, the first is I just love fairy tales. I mean, I've done quite a bit with them before. I had a novella out a few years ago, The Convergence of Fairy Tales, which mashed up, I think, 5 fairy tale princesses into this sort of feminist horror novella. And so I just love the way that fairy tales use a metaphor, how they're a sort of previously understood almost shorthand, and that you can hang a lot off them. You say multiple things at once. So that was the first reason. I think the second reason is that I didn't want this to be a sort of single genre book. I wanted it to be sort of dislocating and destabilizing and shifting around under you, so you're never quite sure where you're standing or what genre you're on. And I think that shift between sort of fairy tale and this sort of surrealism, and then to science, and then to back again, and then to sort of fairy tale horror, it shifts around so much that I think that contributes to the sense of destabilization that is honestly a fundamental part of the grief anyway. This idea that you can no longer rely on something to be there, to be stable, to be solid around you.
And I think you did, in your reading today, you really have highlighted that idea of instability, just in that one scene, and never mind the whole novella. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the structure of the novella, and whether you see any links between fairy tales and the structure, how you've told the story.
Yes and no. It's quite a, there's 4 or 5 chapters, I think, and I could easily have called them part 1, part 2, part 3, instead of chapters, because they are quite discrete. And again, that is part of the destabilization effect that I was going for. You can sort of bounce from one to the other. And I think that linking up those separate sections to different kinds of fairy tales, The Little Mermaid in the first section, where the sea witch succumbs to grief, the Little Red Riding Hood, which is not Anderson, as I think you pointed out when we were editing, but it's still a fairy tale in the second. I think The Nightingale in the third, and then the idea of the magic mirror, I think, in the last one. I think being able to match up these different chapters to different fairy tales helps in that sense of isolation, of, you know, keeping each chapter its own discrete self, which in turn adds to this sort of destabilizing effect of the whole.
Mm-hmm. And the fairy tales add a kind of foundation to the whole thing that pulls throughout the whole story. And
yeah,
while you
there's
do
sort of linkage along, aren't they?
Yeah. And while you do feel destabilized, you also do get something from those connections that help you to move from one part to another, I think.
Yeah, I hope so, because that's, I mean, I don't want to spoil too much for the people who haven't read it, but there are parts of The Little Mermaid that are quite fundamental to how science is portrayed in this novel, and how Sea Witch and Ruby both understand and practice science. And so I think that function of fairy tale as metaphor is extraordinarily useful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about mental health in the novella. Yeah. And so the Impossible Resurrection of Grief focuses on the capital G grief, which is an epidemic of melancholy, and linked to specifically the loss of ecosystems. So during your reading, and by that I mean the video reading that we posted earlier, you did mention that you've been seeing academic papers, and you did mention them tonight as well, that bring up this idea of an emotional toll to climate change, and you're seeing those ideas more often. So I was wondering if you could give us a few examples and talk a little bit about how those academic readings inspired your approach to the novella.
Okay, yes. There's a paper out just last year by Timothy Clark called Ecological Grief and Anthropocene Horror. And he's pointing out in it how ecological grief is very specific in its effects. He says, loss or threatened destruction of a specific landscape, you know, a specific species, a specific place. It's not nebulous, it's not amorphous, it's linked to something that is happening in the world around you, in a place or a species that you love, and everyone has something like that. For me, it's the Great Barrier Reef and red tussocks and mountains. That would be my New Zealand, you know, touchstone. When I'm outside the country, or, you know, I'm thinking of home, I don't actually live in red tussocks and mountains, but that is the image of home that, that sticks with me. And if anything happened to those tussocks, to, the tussock lands in New Zealand, I would be gutted. I really would be. And Clark notes, as a lot of the other people do, looking at how people are responding to climate change, at this idea of the mental health response, the emotional response. He talks about the increase in anxiety disorders. Gross in 2019, talking about how the climate crisis can lead to a mental health crisis, he refers to it as PTSD in advance. Which is, I think, a great way of looking at it. I was at a conference, Haunted Shores, on the sort of ecological and oceanic Gothic about a month or so back, and there's researchers there. We're talking about solastalgia, which was a word I'd never come across before. The sort of homesickness. Yeah, solastalgia, homesickness while still at home, basically. And so I think that is something we see in the world changing around us. And as the effects of climate change become more apparent, I think the effects of that are going to ramp up, because they will become more observable, more experienced. And I think that one of the things that perhaps a lot of the papers on ecological grief aren't looking at so much is the idea of responsibility and blame. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the sort of 20th century conservationist Aldo Leopold from North America. He used to say that one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds.
Wow.
And we have to start looking at who is causing these wounds. I mean, it's one thing to get attached to your cat and suddenly your cat is eaten by a predator or something like that. But it's also a lot of the things that result from ecological grief and result from climate change is things that we are contributing to ourselves. And so there is that aspect of blame, which I think has a likely very profound and probably at the moment underexplored influence on ecological grief. So that was what this book was about, really looking at blame and how it interacts with mourning, this idea of what's gone.
Yeah,
because if the Great Barrier Reef dies, it's our fault.
Yeah.
I mean, it is. We've had plenty of warning. We know it's happening. It's hard not to feel responsible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's a question in the chat from Beverly. Do you think environmental grief is related to how helpless so many of us feel about being able to make the changes necessary? It sometimes feels like individuals can't do enough. Do you think that is addressed in the novella?
I think so, in a way, because Ruby and the Sea Witch, who was, her friend Marjorie, who they were scientists working together at the university, and Marjorie was talking about, all the work they did, all the publishing, all the research, trying to, help avert this future, and it was never enough. And I think I have to wonder too about ecological grief, and I think we have to take a close look at the people who don't get it and who won't get it. I think if you are a politician, for instance, signing off on, mining in the Great Barrier Reef, I don't think you're the type of person, if you can go ahead and do that, who is likely to feel sorrow when it all blows up in your face. I think we have to start looking at people who are just incapable, perhaps, of feeling this grief. And, does it say something about our status as ecological creatures, that we can so cut ourselves off from the rest of nature that, we simply don't care if it dies? It's one thing to care and not be able to stop it, but to have the ability to make profound change and just choose not to because it's not in your interest. Mm-hmm. I think we have to, I think, start looking at the type of personality that can do that.
Yeah, and I think we'll find that there's a lot of overlap between those types of personalities and those who are running everything, essentially. Yeah. So I want to talk about the ending of the novella, but without spoilers. I'm going to try really hard not to spoil anything. So I want to talk specifically about Ruby at the end of the novella. I thought that she was a pretty self-absorbed person. I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. It's certainly complicated with her. And there is a sense that apart from her somewhat selfish perspective, she's also trying to protect herself from the desolation around her. So I'm wondering, are Ruby's instincts towards self-preservation something she learns from what she goes through in the novella, or is it an innate quality or maybe a cultural quality that she inherits? And what roles do you think self-preservation might have in our coming struggle with climate change and ecological loss?
I think it's fundamental. I think she is accused of being monstrously self-involved, and that's accurate. I mean, it also tends to be a feature, I have to say, of most of the female protagonists that I write. I don't know what that says about me, but it interests me, the capacity that we have for preservation, the capacity we have to, you know, make bargains with ourselves and possibly delude ourselves. Talking about the Great Barrier Reef and the carbon emissions it would take to fly me there. I don't have children. That is a massive saving in carbon. Does that mean that I can take a flight to, you know, Queensland and see the reef? Is that a bargain I can honestly make with myself? On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, no. I've never been able to decide how much of my own principles I am willing to overlook in order to get what I want. And the thing is, I'm quite certain that if I did go to the reef, I would be able to excuse it to myself. I'd know deep down that it wasn't, you know, that I was doing possibly the wrong thing, but that knowledge, while lasting, the guilt probably would not. I have to say, there is a strong sense of self-preservation, I think, in the way that we look at the bargains we make to survive in the world. To get what we want. And I think very few people are innocent of that. So what I like to do with Ruby is to strip her down, basically, and it does make her somewhat unpleasant in places, which is why some of the reactions I've had with Georgia, thank God he's getting away from her. But she's a mirror, I think, to a lot of people who will be reading this. And I think there is something valuable in that. And it's not necessarily a terrible thing. I mean, no one wants a miserable life. We all have aspirations. And in this case, in this world, no one wants the grief. No one wants to die and be miserable. No one wants to have loss upset their mental balance so much that they're no longer competent of functioning in the world. And so this idea of preservation is, I think, a valuable one. To an extent. And I think to an extent is as far as we can go with Ruby, because it's the bargains that she makes with herself and the bargains that we make with ourselves. They're entirely personal.
We're actually at 9 o'clock in North America right now, but I did want to pass along this question from Michael DeLuca, who says, do you think Ruby is redeemed by the ending? Is she going to do what the Seed Witch is asking of her? And he also wants to know if that's cheating for him to ask.
I don't know. is I guess the point. I said to Selena when we were editing that maybe it wasn't Ruby who was going to be sucked into this horrible thing. Maybe it's George going home, who has never built up this idea of sort of this self-centered immunity. But I don't know. I've tossed up whether or not I should write a sequel to this. I suppose it depends on the reception of this one. But I wanted to leave it open-ended. I didn't want an ending that said, look, this is what's going to happen, because in a sense, Ruby is all of us. As unpleasant and as insular as she often is, her decision is the decisions that we have to make for ourselves. And I think it's far more effective to have her as a mirror to the reader rather than as an example.
Mm-hmm. But just before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you one last question about any connections that you see between this novella and your novel, which is also climate fiction, The Stone Weta, I believe that's how you say it.
Weta.
Weta.
Weta, yes.
Yeah, so do you make any connections between those? They're both scientist characters, both related to climate change.
They are, but they're very different in their approach. The Stone Weta came out of news stories I was seeing about scientists being limited in their work, being censored by governments and by industries. And so it's a very political response to communication of climate change in a climate change environment. Grief is what happens when that communication has absolutely failed, when it hasn't made a difference. It's the emotional response rather than the political one. They're very, very separate. I'm not sure they could inhabit the same universe, but they're still quite interesting, I think, to look at two different ways of, exploring climate change through fiction.
Mm-hmm, certainly. Yeah, I like that idea of one being a kind of example of what the world might be like if the first novel failed. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so we don't have any more time for questions. I would love to keep talking. It's so fun.
I'm on Twitter if anyone wants to, leave questions there or anything. So
yeah. So what we're going to do right now is give away some prizes. So I have a few prizes. I have these really lovely little thylacine pins made by a local Hamilton author, actually. Surprisingly, I found someone local who was making thylacines things. And then I also have this book that Octavia Cade chose for all of you. And it is by an Indigenous Australian author. And Octavia, did you want to say just a few words about it?
Yes, it's the most fascinating book, and I will go to my grave holding a grudge that it did not win the Booker. Anyway, Alexis Wright, who is this Indigenous Australian author, has written this fantastic sort of Australian future of politics and magical realism and swans and science. And climate change as, it comes up into the cities, and the look especially at race relations in Australia and how climate change impacts upon it is fascinating, and the prose is gorgeous. And if you don't win it, you should go to your local library and find a copy because it's outstanding.
So I'm a bit miffed that I have to give this one away, but I'm going to get one for myself as well. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. We have a nifty little wheel with everybody's name on it. I think we're only going to give out prizes to people who are here. So if we end up picking someone who is not here, then we'll spin again. So, oh, and unfortunately, I can't give anything away to family members and friends. All right, so here we go. So the first prize is a little thylacine pin and actually a Stelliform t-shirt with the beautiful thylacine art on it. So we'll spin for that one first. Ren Hutchings, the first winner. Well, I gotta turn that down, that's really loud. Okay, so Ren, I'll put the Stelliform email in the chat, and you can email me and we'll figure out how to get that to you. All right, we're spinning again, and this one is for a little thylacine pin and the Swan book. All right, so Laura McKay, you are the second winner, the thylacine pin and the Swan book. And again, just email me and we'll figure out how to get that to you. Okay, so congratulations to the prize winners. And yeah, we'll make an arrangement to get those prizes to you. It has been my absolute pleasure to kick off Stelliform Press's second season and host this launch for The Impossible Resurrection of Grief. Congratulations, Octavia. I am thrilled that you chose Stelliform to publish your novella. It is a difficult book. It's an uncomfortable book, but it forces us to look hard at our own responses to the world as it changes before our eyes. And it also asks us to look for those things in the world that we love. Those things like a Great Barrier Reef. The thing that we have to protect is if we're protecting ourselves, because that ecosystem is part of us. But then the book asks us to acknowledge that feeling, that imperative, and expand it. Oh, I see in the chat that maybe Laura McKay isn't here, so we have to do another spin. Okay, we're going to do another spin. So I believe that we're going to give the Swan book to someone else. Marissa Slavin. Is Marissa here? Oh no, is Marissa not here? Oh, that's too bad. Okay, let's spin again then. Every time we spin, it gets more and more likely that you'll win. Lee Williams. Do we have Lee Williams here? Wow, are we going to get through the whole wheel? Octavia, how about you just pick a number between 1 and 20, and as long as it's not 13. A family member. 13, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just count. Rem Wigmore? Yay, okay.
Yay.
All right, good. I hope you don't have that book already. All right.
I think Rem has heard me talk about that book before, so may be glad to get it.
Oh, excellent, excellent. All right. So as I was saying, I think that the book is asking us to look for those things to which we feel the most connection, and then, you know, take that feeling and do something with it. It's not just about feeling sad. It's about doing something with that feeling. Yeah, Octavia, you were talking about the Great Barrier Reef and how that makes you feel. I have similar feelings to the monarch butterfly in North America, and it is also a beleaguered creature in a beleaguered ecosystem, and I don't know what I'm going to do if something happens to it. So I think that your book is doing something similar to that, and it's asking us to acknowledge that we're a part of the world around us, and we have a responsibility to it, not just to feel sad or anxious, but to do something. And for those of us in the affluent West, maybe what we're called to do is to make ourselves uncomfortable so that others can live. So your book is complex and beautiful, and if you don't already have a copy, you can click the link in the chat and get a signed copy printed on recycled paper from the Stelliform website. But the book is also now available to order anywhere where you usually get your books. So as we wrap up, I want to say another thank you as well to Tiff Morris and Shannon Roszell for helping us celebrate. And thank you to Erin Julian and Kristen Shaw for helping out tonight and for the other work that you've done for Stelliform. And thanks again to Divination Hollow for helping us get the word out about the book launch. And finally, thank you everyone who joined us here to help us bring this book into the world. And we'd love to keep in touch with you. So if you want to sign up for Stelliform's newsletter, those links are going up in the chat. We also have a Twitter, an Instagram, and a Facebook that you can follow along. We have another title coming out in 2021, and that is After the Dragons by Cynthia Zhang. It's a very different book, but it is lovely, sweet and sad and wonderful. And of course, we'll be announcing more giveaways and another launch event. So if you like this one, don't miss that one. Octavia, I would like the final word of the event to be yours. So do you have any final thoughts for those here this evening, and also maybe for those who are watching later?
Okay, a couple of very short things. I like your idea of looking for the things that we love and looking to maybe try and preserve them while they're here instead of feeling sad for their loss in advance. Sometimes the idea of climate change and biodiversity loss is so enormous that it's hard to encompass. If you can do something for the monarch butterfly, for instance, then it may be somewhat easier to handle, and you may be able to, downplay the results of guilt and the ecosystem grief that could be coming your way. So there's that. And there's also the one person who hasn't been thanked today, which is Selena, for putting together this lovely launch. And she was the most excellent editor. She made the book much better than the terrible first draft that was sent her way. So if you are looking to share climate fiction of your own, I would encourage you to look at Stelliform in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Octavia. And thank you everybody for coming, and enjoy the rest of your evening.